Every American learns one date in the first grade. 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. 3 ships, 1 king, 1 queen, and a map of the world that changed forever. That's the version we all got. Here is what almost nobody was taught. That same year, in that same court, under those same 2 signatures, a second document was written. It was not a map. It was a deadline. It was a royal order telling an entire people living inside Spain for more than 1,000 years that their public existence was over. Not their lives necessarily, their name, their right to be called by it out loud in daylight. The paper was signed on the 31st of March, 1492, inside a palace in Granada called the Alhambra. And by the time the town criers finished reading it in the market squares of Castile and Aragon, the family standing there had weeks to sell 1,000 years of life, pack what a mule could carry, and walk out of the kingdom. Sell the house, sell the shop, sell the vineyard, and do not take gold, do not take silver, do not take coined money. The law said so, in writing. Or, and this is the part that changes everything, you could stay. All you had to do was walk to a church, kneel at the font, take water on your forehead, and take a new name. Stay and stop being who you were, publicly, forever, or leave before the last day of July. So here is the real question, and it isn't the obvious one. The obvious question is why they expelled them. The harder one is this. Why did a kingdom that had already spent a full century pressuring, converting, and baptizing this community by the tens of thousands still need an expulsion order at all? Think about it. If forced conversion worked, you don't need a deadline. If the walls worked, you don't need a deadline. If the courts worked, you don't need a deadline. They wrote the deadline because everything before it had failed. And that is not my opinion. It is close to what the decree itself says. I'm Morsels. This is History Morsels, buried history in bite-sized pieces. Before we go one step further, answer me in the comments, honestly. Before today, had you ever heard the words Alhambra Decree in a classroom? Yes or no? I want to see the number. To understand what was taken, understand what was there. And it was not a handful of newcomers. Jewish communities had lived on the Iberian Peninsula for well over 1,000 years by 1492, documented back into Roman times. Church councils in the 4th century were already writing rules about Christians and Jews living side by side there. You don't write rules about people who aren't present. They had a name for that land in Hebrew, Sepharad. It appears in the Hebrew Bible in a single line in the book of Obadiah, and by the Middle Ages, the Jews of the peninsula had fixed that name to the ground under their feet. That is why their descendants are still called Sephardi today. Not a guest population, a rooted one, with a homeland name in its own language. And you can still walk into it. In Toledo, there is a building raised around 1180, horseshoe arches, white plaster carved like lace. It is called Santa Maria la Blanca now, Saint Mary the White, because it was taken and turned into a church. It was built as a synagogue. A few streets away stands another, finished in the 1350s by Samuel Ha Abulafia, treasurer of the King of Castile. Hebrew inscriptions run around the walls like a ribbon. Today, it is a museum. Hold that image, because this is the entire video in one shot. The building survives under a different name. Every major city had a Jewish quarter. Castilian speakers called it the Juderia. And it wasn't just houses. The community was organized as an aljama, with its own courts, its own officers, its own schools, and its own taxes owed to the crown. They had physicians the kings actually used, and administrators the kings actually relied on. In Toledo, Jewish scholars sat in translation workshops, turning Arabic science and philosophy into Castilian and Latin, work that fed straight into Europe's universities. So feel the weight of this properly. It was not a suitcase community. It had deeds, street names, and cemeteries their great-grandparents were buried in. Now, I'm not selling you a fairy tale. It was never safe. There were massacres before, and forced conversion pushes before, under Christian and Muslim rulers alike. But through all of it, for 1,000 years, one thing held. They were still legally allowed to exist as themselves, in public, under their own name. And that is the exact thing 1492 ended. The clock did not start in 1492. It started 101 years earlier. In June of 1391, in Seville, a preacher named Ferran Martínez had spent years telling crowds what should happen to the Jewish quarter. That summer, the crowds acted on it. The violence hit Seville first, then moved Córdoba, Toledo, Valencia, Barcelona, Mallorca. City after city, straight through the summer. Thousands were killed, and entire quarters emptied. Then came the part that reshaped Spain for 2 centuries. Tens of thousands of survivors were baptized, under threat, under a blade, under a mob at the door. Historians argue about exact numbers, but the scale is not in dispute. It was the largest mass conversion of Jews in European history to that point. Overnight, Spain had a new category of person, the converso, the new Christian, legally Christian, baptized, registered, attending Mass, but in a suspicious neighbor's eyes, never fully one thing or the other. If the goal was to dissolve a people into the majority, that should have ended the story. It didn't. The pressure increased. In 1412, laws came out of Valladolid that read like an instruction manual for erasing a community from public life without touching a hair on anyone's head. Jews confined to enclosed quarters, barred from royal office, told how to dress so they could be identified on sight, even told which titles of respect they could no longer use. Then came organized preaching campaigns, aimed city by city at the Jewish quarters. Then a public religious debate at Tortosa that ran for over a year, where rabbis were summoned to defend their faith in front of a hostile audience while their communities back home were being worked on. More conversions followed. By the middle of the 1400s, Spain had 2 populations where it once had 1. A shrinking community of practicing Jews and a very large population of new Christians. And here the story turns, because Spain then made a decision about the converts that made everything afterward inevitable. Quick comment check before I tell you. What do you think happened to a family that did exactly what was demanded of them, converted, and played by every single rule? Guess in the comments, then keep watching and see if you were right. In 1449, in Toledo, a revolt over a tax collection produced a local ruling that would poison the next 4 centuries of Spanish life. It declared that converts from Judaism and their descendants could not hold public office in the city. Read that again. Not Jews, converts, baptized Catholics. Their crime was not belief. Their belief had been changed exactly as demanded. Their disqualification was ancestry. That document is generally recognized as the first of the limpieza de sangre statutes, purity of blood. The Pope condemned it. The king objected to it. It survived anyway. And over the following century, the idea spread through Spanish institutions like water through cloth. Cathedral chapters, military orders, colleges, guilds. Applicants had to produce family trees proving no Jewish or Muslim ancestry. Hold both halves together because this is the engine of the whole story. Step 1. The state pressures you to convert, on the theory that your religion is the problem. Step 2. Once you convert, the state builds a legal system saying the problem was never your religion at all, it was your bloodline. Which means conversion could never have worked. It was never going to be accepted as enough. And once you see that, 1492 stops looking like a sudden explosion of anger and starts looking like the last step of a process that had run out of road. Now the machinery arrives. In November of 1478, the Pope authorized Ferdinand and Isabella to appoint inquisitors in Castile. In September of 1480, the first 2 were appointed and sent to Seville. And here is the legal detail almost nobody watching this has ever been told, and it is the key to the entire video. The Inquisition had no jurisdiction over Jews, none. It was a church court, and its authority ran over baptized Christians only. If you were an openly practicing Jew, you were legally outside its reach. The people it could investigate were the Conversos, on suspicion of secretly keeping Jewish practice. Candles lit on a Friday evening, certain foods avoided, clean linen for the Sabbath, small domestic things turned into evidence. In February of 1481, Seville held the first auto de fe, literally an act of faith, the public ceremony where sentences were read to a crowd. We won't dwell on what followed for those convicted. The point here is structural. And in 1483, 2 things happened. A Dominican friar named Tomás de Torquemada was put at the head of the whole system, and the Jews of Andalusia, the region around Seville, Córdoba, and Cádiz, were ordered out. Not the whole kingdom, just that region, a regional expulsion, 9 years before the national one, using the exact reasoning of 1492. As long as practicing Jews lived near converts, the converts would never fully separate from their old life. And at the same time, the walls went up. In an assembly in Toledo in 1480, the crown ordered Jews and Muslims moved into separate enclosed quarters within a set period of time. Gates, boundaries, and an area you were required to sleep inside. So by the late 1480s, 4 tools were running at once: conversion pressure, blood purity exclusion for those who converted, a court with authority over the converted, and physical separation of those who hadn't. And still, on Friday evenings across Castile and Aragon, people were openly, legally, publicly Jewish. That is what the crown had failed to end. January 2nd, 1492. Granada surrenders. The last Muslim-ruled kingdom on the Iberian Peninsula falls to Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, and a war that ran on and off for centuries is over. 2 monarchs at the height of their power, standing in a conquered palace with a unified kingdom under them for the first time. Now watch the next 90 days. They approve an expedition west under a Genoese captain, sailing in August. That's the story you know. And on March 31st, inside that same city, they sign the order, the Edict of Expulsion, the Alhambra Decree. Here is what it contains, and I am being careful because this is a real document and I am not inventing words for it. Its stated reasoning is that despite the Inquisition's work and despite earlier measures, the continued presence of practicing Jews was drawing new Christians back toward Jewish practice, that milder remedies had been tried, that separation had been tried, that regional expulsion had been tried, and that therefore the only remaining remedy was total removal. That is the Crown's own logic, written on the paper. When conversion failed and segregation failed, the answer was subtraction. The terms: every Jew in Castile and Aragon, Men, women, children, the elderly must leave royal territory by the end of July. They could take their goods, but not gold, not silver, not coined money, and not certain other restricted items. And anyone remaining after the deadline without accepting baptism faced the harshest penalties the law allowed, including losing everything they owned. Now, about that countdown, let me be straight with you, because I don't do fake numbers on this channel. The document was signed on March 31st, but it was not proclaimed immediately. The announcements went out to the towns at the end of April and the start of May, and the deadline was the last day of July. On parchment, that's 4 months. From the day a crier actually stood in your square and read it, most communities had roughly 3. And for the towns that got the news late, the practical window to liquidate an entire life came down to about 60 days. 60 days to sell a house that had been in your family for 200 years in a market where every neighbor is selling at the same moment and every buyer knows you cannot say no. A forced sale is not a sale. It is a transfer with paperwork. Spanish chroniclers of the time, including a priest openly hostile to the Jews who had no reason to make them look sympathetic, describe those months. A house traded for a donkey, a vineyard for a length of cloth. When tens of thousands must sell everything by the same date and cannot carry money out, prices don't fall, they collapse. There were attempts to stop it. The 2 most powerful Jewish figures at court argued against the decree in front of the monarchs. Isaac Abravanel, a financier and scholar who had served the crown, and Abraham Senaor, elderly, the community's chief representative and one of the kingdom's most important tax administrators. They failed. Abravanel left for Italy and kept writing for the rest of his life. Senaor did not leave. In June of 1492, in his 80s, he was baptized, with the king and queen themselves standing as his godparents, and he took the name Fernán Pérez Coronel. Sit with that image for a second. It tells you everything about the pressure inside that room. Then came the roads. Some went to Portugal, paying a fee at the border for temporary residence. Some went north to Navarre. Some sailed to North Africa, to Fez and Tlemcen, and many of those crossings went badly. And the largest organized welcome came from the east, where the Ottoman Sultan, Bayezid II, ordered that the refugees be received in his territories. Thousands settled in Salonika, Constantinople, Izmir, and Safed. How many left? Here, historians genuinely fight, and I want you to hear the disagreement instead of a fake clean number. Older estimates ran very high, 150,000, 200,000, more. Modern researchers, working from tax records and community registers, argue for far lower figures, that Spain's Jewish population before the decree was perhaps 80 to 100,000, and that a very large share, possibly close to half, chose baptism over exile. So the honest answer is that tens of thousands went, and tens of thousands stayed and converted. And staying, as you are about to see, was not the happy ending. Comment moment, and this one always splits the room. If it were your family, your house, your shop, your parents' graves in that town with 60 days on the clock, do you take the water and stay, or take the road and go? There is no right answer. That is exactly why I'm asking. Slow down here, because the word expulsion hides what actually happened. This was not primarily an order to kill, it was an order to erase a category. Look at the choice cleanly. Option A, leave and keep the name. Option B, stay and give up the name. There is no option C, where you stay and remain openly, publicly Hebrew. That option was legislated out of existence. After the summer of 1492, in Castile and Aragon, there was no such thing as a legal Jewish community, no Alhambra, no synagogue holding public service, no rabbi with recognized authority. Buildings changed hands, and quarters got new residents and eventually new names on the map. That is what disappear means in this story, not vanishing from the earth, vanishing from the public record as a name. And now the trap closes. Remember, the Inquisition could not touch practicing Jews, only baptized Christians. So every family that chose option B walked out of one legal category and straight into another. They stopped being outside the Inquisition's jurisdiction and became, from that moment, subject to it. The expulsion did not reduce the Inquisition's workload. It expanded the pool of people it could legally investigate by tens of thousands in a single summer. Which means the next chapter of Spanish history isn't really the story of Jews at all. It's the story of new Christian families for generations being watched. Households where the outward life was entirely Catholic and where something else, thinner with every generation, was kept behind a closed door. Historians call them crypto-Jews. Crypto just means hidden. Some kept a candle lit on a Friday with the shutters closed. Some kept a grandmother's Hebrew name spoken only at home. And some kept only a habit whose reason had been forgotten 3 generations back, a food avoided, a phrase said at a funeral in a language nobody in the room could still translate. Meanwhile, the blood purity statutes kept spreading. Descendants of converts had to produce family trees to enter universities, guilds, offices, and religious orders, and professional genealogists made a living certifying or refusing to certify that a family was clean. So the promise of 1492 was false in both directions. Leave and you lose the ground. Stay and you lose the name, and you still are not accepted, because the system you converted into had already decided back in 1449 that ancestry outranks belief. That is the mechanism this channel keeps running into century after century. The erasure of a people's public name is almost never an accident. It is written down, it has a date, it has signatures, and it is usually filed as the solution to a problem the authorities created themselves. But here is the other side of the ledger. They took the buildings, the quarters, and the legal standing. They did not get the language. The Spanish those families spoke in 1492 went on to the ships with them, and it kept going. In Salonika, Sarajevo, Istanbul, and Izmir, families were still speaking a form of 15th century Spanish written in Hebrew letters 400 years later. They called it Ladino. There are still speakers alive today, and linguists now listed as endangered and are racing to record it. A country expels a population, and that population carries the country's own language out with it, frozen at the moment of departure for 400 years. There is also a tradition, and I am calling it tradition, not documented fact, that some families carried the keys to their Iberian houses into exile and passed them down. Museums hold keys donated with that story attached. Whether every one is authentic, nobody can prove, but the fact that the story exists at all tells you what those families believed they were owed. So, the hard part, honestly. Why did Ferdinand and Isabella actually do it? There are 4 serious answers. Historians still argue about the mix, and I'll give you all 4 straight. 1. Religion. They believed it. The monarchs saw themselves as completing a religious unification of the peninsula. Granada falls in January, the edict comes in March. On this reading, the decree is the same project as the war, continued by paperwork. 2. The Converso problem. This is the reason the document itself gives. The crown had staked enormous authority on the claim that new Christians could be made into reliable Catholics, and if converts kept drifting back, the whole program looked like a failure. Removing the source of influence was the stated fix. 3. Money. The cynical read is that the crown had just fought an expensive war, and here was a wealthy community whose property was about to hit the market at forced sale prices. But most modern historians who have gone through the accounts say the crown itself did not get rich from it. The community's tax revenue vanished along with the community, and the real winners were local buyers picking up land for almost nothing. 4. Politics. A newly unified state, 2 crowns joined, and a population that had just been mobilized for a religious war. Nothing consolidates a fragile new political unit faster than defining who is outside it. And the disagreement is real. Some historians emphasize religious conviction. Others argue this was a bureaucratic fix for the Converso question, meaning the real target was never the Jews of Spain at all, but the Christians of Spain whose ancestry was suspect. I'm not going to pretend I can settle a debate people spend careers on. But whatever the motive at the top, the effect at the bottom was identical. A community that had been in that land for 1,000 years had, by the end of that summer, no legal public existence in it. So, jury duty. Comments open. Which one do you think actually drove it? Faith, control, money, or politics? One word. I read these. And now the part that made me want to make this video, because 1492 did not stay in Spain. What Ferdinand and Isabella produced that March morning was not just an order, it was a template, a legal format, a reusable instrument with a proclamation, a deadline, a property restriction, and baptism as the escape clause. And that format traveled. Within 4 years, it crossed into Portugal, where the king issued his own expulsion order in 1496, then in 1497 did something even the Spanish Decree had not, and simply had the population baptized by force rather than let them leave. In 1498, it reached Navarre. Within a decade, Provence, and over the next century, versions of it surfaced in kingdom after kingdom across southern Europe. And the Alhambra Decree itself? It sat on the Spanish books, technically unrepealed, for 476 years. It was not formally revoked until December of 1968. 1968, men were about to walk on the moon. And in 2015, 523 years after that March morning in Granada, Spain passed a law offering citizenship to the descendants of the people it had expelled. Portugal did something similar. Tens of thousands of families applied, from Turkey, from Morocco, from Israel, from Brazil, and from right here in the United States. Which leaves the question I'm handing you, and it is not a rhetorical one. If a state has to write a law in the 21st century to undo a document from the 15th, then that document was never really history, was it? It was still operating. That is the thread I want to pull next, and I need to know if you want it, because the next step is not the ships, and it is not the frontier, it is the paperwork. What happened when this legal format spread across Europe, got refined, got copied, and got attached to the machinery of empire? That's a different video, and I'll make it if this one lands. So here is the ask. If you learned something today, hit subscribe. It's free, and it tells the algorithm to put buried history in front of somebody else's feed tonight. And in the comments, tell me 3 things. 1. Had you heard the words Alhambra Decree before this video, yes or no? 2. 60 days on the clock, water and stay or road and go? 3. What's the year you thought you knew that turned out to have a second document behind it? Because that is the whole premise of this channel. The dates you memorized are real. It's the paperwork underneath them that nobody handed out. I'm Morsels. That was 1492. The other one. See you in the next piece.